rules that Yagi Toshinori was still struggling to instill into his students. Rules that seemed so trivial and mundane that it seemed a bit ludicrous that heroes had to learn it in the first place. The first was to take every task seriously, no matter how trivial it may have seemed. Young Bakugo especially struggled with that one, giving up on a task once it was completed to his satisfaction, or if it was deemed trivial, he often would make matters worse. The second rule was to be mindful of your stamina. This was a bittersweet lesson for Toshinori, because it was his disregard for this rule that left him with only an hour of hero time each day. He saw the same tendencies in a few of his students, such as young Kirishima and young Satoa. Finally, the third and most important rule was to always be aware of your surroundings. Ashido probably struggled the most with this, and Toshinori was struggling to find a way to teach the girl the rule before someone else had to pay the price of her inattention. These rules were cycling through Toshinori's mind when he woke up. After enough years of dealing with crime, a person gets almost a sixth sense for it. When Toshinori woke up that day, he could feel it in his bones that something bad was going to happen. He was already calculating how much hero work he would be able to accomplish, but a lot of it depended on luck. Toshinori just hoped that he would have time left when it was needed. Distracted by his worrying, Toshinori didn't notice the dip in the sidewalk. He barely managed to catch himself from falling, but the papers in his hands were not nearly as lucky. Cursing under his breath, Toshinori moved to gather the papers, but a pair of freckled hands were already collecting them for him. Toshinori looked up to see a pair of bright green eyes that looked vaguely familiar, eyes that held far too much recognition for Toshinori's comfort. Wordlessly, the boy shoved the papers into the hero's hands and scrambled away, giving Toshinori a better view of the retreating figure. He was short, and clearly still a teenager, wearing a dirty hoodie over ripped jeans. Everything about him screamed that he was a hoodlum. The boy's appearance combined with Toshinori's uneasiness put the man on even higher alert. Something told him that that boy would have a hand in whatever was going to unfold. Throughout the day, he would have described the anxiety plaguing him as a pit in his stomach if he still had a stomach. His teaching suffered because of it, and young Bakugo wasn't shy about telling him so. Luckily, it wasn't just Toshinori, however, that felt off. No, a sense of looming danger hung over all the students in the hero course, one that the teachers felt even more acutely. Toshinori was making a lot of the same mistakes he'd made his first year of teaching. Luckily, his students had grown immensely since then and there weren't any incidents. They were in the middle of an exercise dealing with rescuing hostages when his phone rang. Seeing who was calling, Toshinori answered immediately. "What is it, Tsukauchi?" "We've got a huge fight, Toshinori," the detective's terse voice informed him. "I've got an undercover detective in the middle of it all, so I need you and whichever heroes you think are best for the job, now. This isn't a job for your students." With that, Tsukauchi hung up, only for a text message with an address to come through. Swallowing thickly, the hero called Nedzu. Before the principal could even really answer, All Might said, "I need you to watch my class. There's a situation that I was called into." After a few moments he added, "And Midnight and Eraserhead are needed as well." "Very well. I shall inform the other two and be there momentarily," Nedzu responded. And sure enough, before Toshinori could do more than explain the situation to his class, Nedzu was already strolling into the room. The pro-hero rushed to the parking lot where his truck waited, along with Aizawa and Nomori. Luckily, the two were okay with Toshinori's breakneck pace, and Aizawa was a good navigator. All Might knew he'd found the place when they drove up to a warehouse positively swarmed by police cars. Tsukauchi was pacing outside the warehouse looking more stressed than All Might had ever seen him. Still in the truck, Toshinori transformed into his hero persona. Looking at Aizawa and Nomori respectively, he could tell that all three heroes were ready for whatever came. They moved towards Tsukauchi uniformly, ready to be debriefed. Toshinori tried to keep his surprise from showing the man was fretting. Turning to the heroes, Tsukauchi said, "We have no idea what the situation is inside, We lost contact without undercover detective. There's over 50 people inside, most if not all with extensive criminal records. Be vigilant. Don't get my boy killed. All Might shivered at the emotions in the detective's voice before accepting an earpiece from Aizawa. I'll go in first, he was saying. I'll keep you all updated on the situation so we don't just make it worse. The other two nodded and Aizawa was gone, disappearing into the warehouse. Toshinori stationed himself by one of the doors, fully prepared to burst in at a moment's notice. Then, he listened. Okay, I'm getting close to the main fight. It doesn't sound as violent as I expected, crackled Aizawa's voice. I'll have a visual soon. All Might whispered the update to Tsukauchi, whose stress was palpable. Both men stood at attention, not daring to speak. They're at a ceasefire, Aizawa said. The two leaders are already talking things over to end it all without bloodshed. It's all because of some kid with green hair. Upon hearing that information, Tsukauchi breathed in a sigh of relief. I don't know how the kid does it. I'm guessing the kid is our undercover detective. He's amazing. He's gotten everyone to stop fighting, but he still hasn't blown his cover, came Aizawa's voice. All Might couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. The two were going on 3 years of teaching together, and he had never heard the man give such high praise to anyone. I take it he's one of yours? All Might asked Tsukauchi in a low voice. Our youngest detective yet, the man said proudly. Midoriya is the best analytical mind we have. It's a good thing his mother doesn't want to move, or he would have been poached by some other district already. Offers are still pouring in for him. What kind of quirk does he have? He seems to have handled this all incredibly smoothly, All Might said curiously. He's actually quirkless, Tsukauchi said blandly. Years ago he had his heart set on being a hero, but apparently he was involved in an incident. He tried to help out, but the pros just berated him and one even told him to keep his dreams attainable. It honestly almost broke the kid, but whoever that hero was made one of the biggest mistakes of their lives. Midoriya may be quirkless, but he's one of the most determined and skilled people I've ever met. A chill ran down All Might's spine as he remembered an incident years ago with a scrawny green-haired boy. Was it his words that had nearly broken the child? Surely that couldn't have been the boy that had just impressed Eraserhead so deeply. He was far too young to be a detective, if All Might remembered correctly. Where was that child? Toshinori probably should have kept better tabs on the boy who knew his secret. Aizawa's voice broke All Might from his ponderings. Send in Midnight. If she's stealthy enough, we should get this resolved with minimal injury. Got it. I'm coming in, Midnight said into the earpiece. Shortly after, however, Aizawa gasped. What's going on, Eraserhead? Toshinori demanded. Someone's using their quirk. I can't find them, and... The audio was overtaken by static, confirming the feeling in Toshinori's gut that everything was going too well. Eraserhead? Eraserhead. Midnight? All Might could feel his heart slamming in his chest. When neither hero answered him, Toshinori said, someone's using their quirk in there, I'm going in. Tsukauchi moved to protest, but All Might was already barreling through the doors with his signature laugh and catchphrase. It was just then that the earpiece started working again. MIT All Might, we almost had it, Eraserhead was hissing. All Might didn't know what all the fuss was about as the situation seemed to be in hand. Thanks to Midnight's quirk, almost all the men were unconscious, and those that weren't were swiftly rendered useless by Eraserhead. A job well done, fellow heroes, All Might said with a booming laugh, a laugh loud enough to cover the sound of a gun being cocked. Move. A young voice called before something collided into Toshinori, jolting the man before a gunshot rang across the warehouse. Static seemed to fill Toshinori's ears as he felt time slow down. The thing, or person, rather, who had collided with Toshinori collapsed onto the hero, something warm and wet seeping onto him. Looking down, Toshinori found a head of green hair that contrasted with the blood that was beginning to cover both him and the boy who had just taken a bullet for the #1 hero. Coughing wetly, the boy almost fell to the ground before Toshinori remembered himself and caught the boy, gently lowering him to the ground. In the background, he heard the telltale sounds of midnight taking care of the gunman. But right now, the boy's life depended on Toshinori's assistance. For the first time in years, Toshinori wished that he had his cape, any loose fabric he could rip off to staunch the bleeding. As it was, he had no option but to use his massive hands to press down on the boy's abdomen, praying to some higher power that he was helping. But the boy's breath was still coming out as violent gasps of air, his green eyes darting around, unseeing. All Might's stomach sank as he recognized those same green eyes and freckles he'd been wary of that same morning. What was that gunshot? Tsukauchi demanded, rushing in after Toshinori. Seeing the boy on the ground, the man froze before growling, "I want restraints on every person in here that isn't one of us. We need an ambulance now." All Might flinched at the ferocity in his old friend's voice. Police officers poured in, complying with the man's every order, though many hardened upon seeing the boy in Toshinori's arms. Orders given, Tsukauchi collapsed beside the boy, ripping off his jacket to try and staunch the bleeding, which was infinitely more helpful than Toshinori's hands. "Midoriya, stay with me," the detective begged. "Just keep breathing." Finally, those green eyes found something to focus on as the boy looked up, latching onto the form of the older detective. When he did speak, the wheezes were barely recognizable as words. "Trying to, sir," the boy said, pausing to cough. To their horror, drops of blood sprayed out with each cough. "Just, in case, tell Mom, love her. Kid. I order you not to die," Tsukauchi said seriously, pressing even harder on his jacket. "I will not explain this to your mother. You have to keep fighting. You know, always follow orders," Midoriya rasped, quirking his lips into the barest trace of a smile before his eyelids fluttered shut. Toshinori swallowed thickly, feeling like this was somehow his fault. The bullet had been meant for him, he knew, and this child had intercepted it, and based on their interaction, this child was Tsukauchi's detective. There were fundamental rules that are so logical that one wouldn't think that heroes needed to learn them. The third and most important rule pounded through his head, and he could practically hear the voices of his students critiquing him the same way that they would critique one another in an exercise. Why was there anyone still awake to attack? Aizawa would ask in that steely voice. Iida and Yaoyorozu would fight to analyze the situation first, but in the end Yaoyorozu would win. There hadn't been sufficient time for Midnight's quirk to fully spread throughout the room, and All Might's entrance brought in more airflow to disperse her quirk, allowing the villains to further resist. When he mistakenly thought the situation was taken care of, he made enough noise to allow the villains the element of surprise. And which rule was broken? Aizawa would ask, staring Toshinori down so he would know exactly what he had done. "Ooh, I know." Ashido would shout, jumping up and down. "It's my rule, the third and most important rule." Toshinori had let his guard down, foolishly unaware of his surroundings. And just as he always warned his students, All Might was not the one who paid the price. Indeed, instead it was paid by his closest friend's protege. Chapter 2. 3 years ago. It only took a matter of minutes for Midoriya Izuku's dream and entire plan for his future to be shattered. He had spent the first 12 years of his life surrounding himself with everything he could find about heroes, devising various ways to become one without a quirk. Izuku's dream was the dream of many, but his motivation was considerably more pure. Rather than seeking fame and fortune, Midoriya Izuku merely wanted to help people, to use his smile to reassure people in the darkest of times, remind them that the world still held light. But in the boy's darkest time, his hero failed him, offering neither verbal reassurance, nor the smile he was famed for. Midoriya Izuku did not die that day, but his sense of purpose did. The boy stumbled away from the rooftop, silently wondering if he should heed his classmate and stumble off of it instead. Tears he didn't realize he'd shed coursed down his cheeks as he pondered the truth of his hero's identity, as well as all that All Might had told him. Without realizing, the boy's legs had carried him to yet another crowd, a villain fight. It didn't seem like much of a fight though, and it felt empty to him. Then he took in the details of the fight, the villain who was all too familiar and the red eyes pleading for help, red eyes that Izuku could never forget. The sludge villain had Kachan. Before Izuku knew what he was doing, his legs carried him forward, slinging his bag at the sludge villain's eye, his one vulnerable spot. The villain recoiled, giving Izuku just enough leeway to start pulling his classmate out of the sludge. For the second time that day, a single punch from All Might took down the sludge villain, bringing immense relief to the crowd. People murmured amongst themselves, acting as judge and jury over what had just happened. What was that scrawny kid trying to accomplish? He just made more work for the heroes, a particularly venomous woman asked. I think he just wanted attention, another woman said. Some kids are so pathetic. Every instinct was telling Izuku to run, leave this place, but the cruel words froze him in place. What do you think you're doing? A rough voice asked, an equally rough hand grabbing the boy by the arm. Looking up, Izuku was peering into the face of Death Arms. The man was a passable hero. Izuku could have told him numerous ways the man could maximize his quirk. Unfortunately, the man was held back by his idolization of All Might. I just wanted to help, Izuku stammered. If you're going to interfere, you better have the quirk to back it up, Death Arms growled, shaking Izuku a bit. For real kid, Mount Lady interrupted. I'm just starting out. Do you want my career to be ruined because of you? Mount Lady, Death Arms, stand down, said a much more logical voice. Izuku raised his eyes to see none other than Kamui Woods, who gently put his hand on Izuku's shoulder. Listen kid, your intentions were noble today. I understand that you were just trying to help out your friend, and that's admirable. But it was incredibly dangerous. We've trained for this for years, we're the experts, so until you have the training to joining us, trust us to handle it, okay? The hero's words were kind, but more than anything Izuku wanted to go home. Disgustingly enough, he could still feel a layer of slime coating his esophagus, and part of him wanted to cry even though he didn't have any tears left. A part of his mind whispered that he should ask Kamui Woods if he could become a hero, but All Might himself had already counseled him against his dream. It was generally unwise to blatantly ignore advice from the world's top hero. The image of his mother apologizing to him flashed through his mind. He'd been told it was an impossible dream his entire life, but it was finally starting to sink in. Izuku Midoriya really was just a useless Deku. Mind numb, Deku stumbled away from the scene, aware of the heroes still yelling at him, but not caring. His legs started on the way home, everything in him screaming to go home, go to where it was safe. He was stopped on his way by the last person in the world he wanted to see. The other heroes already lectured me, Izuku said before All Might could say anything. Thank you for saving me and Kachan. It's clear now that I'll never be a hero. All Might was taken aback. The change in the child was drastic enough that for a moment he wondered if this was the same boy. Young man, Oh, Deku said quietly, green eyes dull. Your secret. It's safe, I swear I won't tell anyone. Izuku shuffled on, leaving a shocked All Might in his wake. Gone was the determined young man that had impressed All Might, and the pro-hero couldn't help but feel that he had had a hand in it. The hero debated with himself for a moment before deciding it was best to just leave. He wasn't equipped to deal with the boy's emotions, after all. At least, that was what he told himself. His second, or did that count as third? Encounter with All Might barely even registered in Deku's mind. Almost nothing registered in his mind, though. He was nearly home when he heard pounding footsteps on the sidewalk beside him. Deku. Bakugo howled, fury emanating from him. When Izuku turned around to face the irate blonde, it was an explosion that greeted the boy. It was the biggest explosion Bakugo had used on him yet, burning his face and chest as well as throwing the boy to the ground. What was that? Bakugo seethed. Do you think you're better than me or something? When Izuku didn't respond, the blonde kicked the fallen boy. Answer me. Izuku opened his mouth to say something, but another voice rang out. Katsuki Bakugo. Step away from my son, now, Inko Midoriya yelled, exiting her house looking like the embodiment of rage itself. The blonde boy stiffened, unused to being caught or reprimanded. Red eyes glaring at the smaller boy, he spat, You better watch yourself, Deku. Remember you're worthless. I know, the boy said faintly, finally glancing up at his former friend. Bakugo stared for a moment, shocked by how dead the boy's eyes were. Before, they always held that stupid, inextinguishable shine to them. But now Izuku Midoriya sat before him, broken. It wasn't nearly as satisfying as he thought it would be. Inko caught Katsuki by surprise, bodily shoving him away from her son. Stay away from Izuku, she snarled, collecting her dazed and injured child into her arms. Come on Izuku, you need to go to the hospital. I'm sorry, Mom, the green-haired boy mumbled, but he was promptly shushed. No Izuku, Inko said. I'm sorry you've been dealing with this alone until now. You shouldn't have hidden it from me, but it's in the past and it's time to move forward. The mother and son shared plenty of tears as they took a cab to the hospital. The cab driver discreetly wiped away a few tears himself when he heard the boy begin recounting the day's events. When they reached the hospital, he waved away Inko's payment, instead wishing Izuku a quick recovery. Luckily, inside the hospital, they weren't kept waiting for very long. A kind female doctor came into the waiting room only minutes after they had signed in, calling, Izuku Midoriya? Izuku pushed himself to standing, feeling close to fainting from the pain. Following the doctor, a host of worries plagued his mind, the foremost being the explanation he would have to give to yet another person. He was exhausted in all aspects of the word, wanting nothing more than to collapse into his bed and sleep for days. Thankfully, the doctor was kind, listening attentively and only asking the questions she absolutely had to before beginning her examination. Other than an unpleasant throat swab, the procedures were quick and painless. The kind woman gave Inko very detailed instructions on what to do, which was good because Izuku retained none of it. The mother and son decided to walk home, and Izuku kept shooting, discreet, worried glanced at Izuku. Most of the walk passed by in relative silence until Inko asked, How long has this been happening? The bullying, I mean. Izuku merely shrugged, which only served to make Inko more worried. The two trudged in silence once more. We're going to move, Inko blurted out. And we can enroll you in online school if you want. You're smart enough you could probably finish early. I'm sorry I didn't see it until now, Izuku, but you've been living the wrong life. I know my son, and he's not meant to waste away being bullied. My son is the kindest, bravest person in the world, and he's meant for a life where his smile makes other people feel better. Whatever you decide to do, Izuku, I fully support you. Tears were slipping down the woman's cheeks as she made her bold declaration. He didn't know when it had happened, but tears were slipping down Izuku's cheeks as well. The first emotion he'd felt in hours sparked in his mind, and then he was flinging himself at his mother, sobbing. I'm never going to be a hero, Izuku sobbed, clutching Inko even tighter. You're already a hero, Inko said, though tears of her own. You're my hero and so much more. One day you'll see what I see. Chapter 3. True to Inko's word, the family of two soon moved to a modest house on the other side of town. It was closer to where Inko worked, a quieter neighborhood, and most importantly it was free of one Bakugo Katsuki. Once Izuku had recovered mentally and physically, he began online school and found that he enjoyed it immensely. Izuku had always loved learning, but it was indescribably better when it was unhindered by classmates who didn't feel he belonged. It was also an online school that allowed the students to set their own pace, and as such Izuku blew through it in record time. Now he could fixate on any given subject he wished and learn absolutely everything that the school's database had to offer, all without being called a freak. For once, life was peaceful. Any issues with Kachan had been buried, definitely unresolved, but stamped down until they couldn't bother Izuku. Inko had wanted to take the Bakugo family to court, but Izuku had talked her out of it. He had never told his mother the full extent of the bullying, so he was able to downplay a lot of it. Strangely enough, he had forgiven the boy for everything, and he just couldn't shake the feeling that Kachan had the potential to be a great hero one day. Even if that wasn't Izuku's future, he didn't want to take the chance away from his former friend. As much as Izuku knew that Kachan could be good, he didn't trust it to just happen. Izuku would be watching his hero career closely. If Kachan didn't improve himself, he would have Izuku to answer to, one way or another. Izuku enjoyed his new life, at least for now. He knew the charm of it would likely fade sooner rather than later, and that such a solitary lifestyle would only hurt him in the long run. He had accepted that heroism wasn't a possibility for him, but nothing had diminished the desire to help people. He still felt the overwhelming need to prove the world to be a safe place. It had been a tough pill to swallow, but now Izuku saw that everything that All Might had said was for the boy's safety in the long run. A part of Izuku's mind whispered that he could have been a hero regardless, but maybe finding a different path wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. He would just have to do some exploration before he decided what that path would be. As he settled into his new life, Izuku quickly found that if he didn't force himself into some sort of schedule, he forgot to eat and sleep. He also figured that blowing through an entire semester of schoolwork in 3 weeks might not be the healthiest option. With this in mind, Izuku began working towards being healthier. He had never been very athletically inclined, but he realized that if he were stronger, faster, it would be easier for him to help people in the future. It began with the boy going on runs. At the beginning Izuku felt like he was going to die, but each day he ran a bit farther than the last, and a bit quicker as well. On one of these runs he came across a dojo that advertised several different fighting styles. Remembering all the times Izuku had felt completely defenseless in his life, the idea of the dojo stuck in his mind. He hesitantly brought it up to his mother, who agreed more readily than Izuku had expected. A few days later the two Midoriyas walked into the dojo to find the owner cleaning up after the latest lesson. He was an older man who wore his scars and his wrinkles with equal amounts of pride, a lifetime of fighting evident in his every movement. Izuku gasped before immediately throwing himself into a bow. "You're the former pro-hero Valiant. It's an honor to meet you, sir." The man chuckled, a bit surprised. "It's rare that I meet anyone your age that has even heard of me, let alone recognizes me not in costume. What can I do for you, boy?" At Inko's nudge, Izuku eased out of his bow, admiration still clear on his face. "I'm Midoriya Izuku, Valiant, sir. I would like to be trained at your dojo, if you're okay with that, that is. If not, I'm sure I could find somewhere eventually, but this really is my first." The torrent of words calmed when Valiant placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Well, young Midoriya, I'd like to get to know you a bit and then we can decide if my dojo would be a good fit for you." Gesturing for the two to follow him, Valiant led the way to a small office, where the former pro-hero listened to Izuku stammer about himself, offering complete, if somewhat rambling answers. Overall, though, Valiant couldn't help but be impressed with this boy's character and determination, as well as his mind. "I would love to take you on as one of my students, young Midoriya. For training purposes, though, I need to know what your quirk is," Valiant said, absent-mindedly beginning paperwork for the boy. At the man's words though, both Midoriyas froze in place, afraid of the reaction their answer would provoke. In a small, quivering voice, Izuku nearly whispered, "I'm quirkless." Valiant's years of training as a pro had taught the man how to disguise his emotions, so there was no surprise on his face when Izuku spoke up. He had fully expected a mental quirk of some kind with how perceptive the child was, but if anything he was more intrigued after learning that Izuku was quirkless. Clearing his throat, he said, "That makes my job easier. It can be difficult to find a fighting style to suit a certain quirk, but this means that you have an entire world of possibilities before you." It warmed Valiant's heart to see his newest student straighten up, beaming brighter than the sun itself. But the image of Izuku's tragic resignation to his fate made the retired pro feel like his heart was in a vice grip, squeezing tighter than he thought possible. When a knock sounded at the door, Valiant abruptly realized what time it was. His interview with Midoriya had taken longer than necessary, and now his next student was here for his private lesson. Rising from his seat, Valiant opened the door to his office. "Thank you for being patient, Ojiro. I would like you to meet my newest student, Midoriya Izuku." Izuku craned his neck to see the boy around the teacher, a blond boy that looked overwhelmingly kind. He would have been a bit plain looking if it weren't for his massive tail. He immediately smiled at Izuku. "It's nice to meet you, Midoriya. Is this your first time in martial arts?" At Izuku's nod, the boy said, "Well, I look forward to sparring with you." The smaller boy nodded, inwardly lamenting that Ojiro would likely refuse to talk to him once he found out that Izuku was quirkless. Until that day, however, he planned to bask in the boy's kindness as long as it lasted. Soon enough, Izuku's martial arts lessons became a bright spot in his weeks. Valiant's quirk was a slight enhancement of his physical abilities. He was stronger, more flexible and dexterous than the average human being, but it was just barely beyond what a quirkless person could achieve. Valiant had never been in the top few heroes, but he had been successful, and Izuku had always respected the man. He had also followed Valiant's hero career closely, as the man was as close to a quirkless hero as Izuku had ever found. Just as Izuku respected his teacher, the man grew to respect the boy in return. He had instantly been drawn in by how bright and genuine Midoriya was. However, Valiant was consistently impressed by how the boy managed to excel at everything he was shown, not through some innate ability, but because the boy tirelessly practiced everything he was shown. Midoriya had a whole host of others who he impressed as well. In order to give his students variety, Valiant often brought in other instructors to introduce different fighting styles. Many of these were pro heroes who Valiant had helped train years ago, and almost every instructor asked about Midoriya. Gunhead was especially impressed by the boy. That was not to mention the other students, who were inspired by the boy's determination and drawn in by his kindness. And so it was in Valiant's dojo that Izuku slowly found a place to be comfortable, a place to belong. The day that Izuku had dreaded came and passed without incident, the other students barely reacting to the fact that Izuku was quirkless. Ojiro, Izuku's closest new friend, especially didn't care. He had merely shrugged and said, "I hope you don't expect me to go easy on you, because I won't." And true to his words, Ojiro had held nothing back, leading to a particularly spectacular loss. The new neighborhood also quickly adopted the mother and son. Inko made the best food and gave freely, and Izuku could usually be found offering help of some kind, be it weeding Mrs. Tachibana's flower beds or watching Mrs. Kyoto's children when she needed to run to the grocery store. But Izuku wanted more. He felt like there was something he needed to be working towards, and the feeling haunted him day and night. One day a few weeks into his new training, the feeling was almost tangible within Izuku, distracting him as he sparred with Ojiro, and the distraction was enough that Izuku didn't see the tail coming, leaving the green-haired boy sprawled on the floor, staring at the ceiling. The amicable blonde immediately dropped his fighting stance. "Are you okay, Midoriya? You normally see that move coming from a mile away." Izuku stoved himself to his feet with a groan. "I'm fine, just a little distracted." "Is everything all right?" "Yeah, it's fine. I'm actually happy lately, like happier than I've ever been. Things are really good right now." Izuku smiled bitterly. The UA entrance exams are soon, right? When I was younger, that was my dream. Midoriya, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. But you could probably still. I'm fine, Ojiro. That dream is officially dead. I just miss the sense of purpose it gave me, you know? I know I want to do something in life that helps people, I just don't know what. After thinking a moment, Ojiro said, You know, Midoriya, I saw something about EMT classes being offered a few blocks away. It's probably not what you want to do with the rest of your life, but you would be learning valuable skills that would make you more equipped to help people. As Izuku pondered his friend's words, he visibly brightened. That's a great idea, Ojiro. I'll have to look into that tonight. And I probably won't see you again until after it's over, so good luck on UA's entrance exam. I know you'll do fantastic. Valiant shook his head as his two favorite students parted ways. Those boys were good for one another, they each balanced the other out. Somehow Ojiro was able to slow Midoriya's hectic mind so that others could understand what the boy was trying to say to others, and Midoriya brought Ojiro further out of his shell than ever before. The two were on different paths in life, but Valiant could feel that they were both pursuing greatness. That night Izuku brought up the possibility of EMT classes to Inko, and once more the mother was easily persuaded. It was rare enough that Izuku asked for anything, so when he did, Inko always found a way to make things happen. Besides, medical knowledge was always a good thing to have. The two decided that they would go to get the necessary paperwork and such tomorrow afternoon, once Inko was off of work. The next morning as Izuku was on his run, he contemplated how much life could change in 10 months. He had slowed down his studies to a more casual pace, and as such he was almost finished with the schoolwork for his first year of high school. Once Izuku had a little more direction on what he wanted to do as a career, he calculated that he could have at least one college degree finished by the time that most kids his age were graduating high school. His prospects were infinitely better than they had during his time in middle school, and Izuku was starting to believe that he might be able to make something of himself after all, with or without a quirk. The biggest change, however, was that he was happy. Every step that he took was a step closer to helping people. He had friends now, and teachers that legitimately cared about him. Izuku's happy train of thought was not to last, however. He was first alerted by a tiny cry of distress that he almost didn't notice. Cautiously halting, Izuku monitored the area around him. He was in a less familiar part of town, an old neighborhood that was largely abandoned. In fact, aside from the distress call, Izuku didn't see any evidence of any other life. Trying to get his breathing under control, Izuku heard yet another sharp cry, making it easier to trace the sound. As Izuku crept towards the alleyway he suspected was the source of the sound, a rough voice growled, "Shut up. You know this is your home now." The child's wailing nearly stopped Izuku's heart, but it also covered the sound of his approach. Peering around the corner, Izuku found a large cardboard box that hosted a multitude of stained rags that resembled a sort of nest. Cans and plastic food packaging littered the ground, and a man with matted hair stood with his back to Izuku, looming over an only marginally cleaner child. "I want to go home," the girl cried, her tears making tracks in the dirt that was caked on her face. Izuku started in surprise. He recognized the girl. She had been a hot topic on the news for the past 2 days because she had mysteriously gone missing, suspected to be kidnapped. There were no witnesses to it and no leads on the disappearance. The news had proclaimed that the search for the child was beginning to look hopeless that very morning. But here she was, living in an alleyway in an abandoned part of town. His mind was running 1,000,000 miles per minute. Izuku knew he should call the police, but he couldn't be overheard, and he refused to take his eyes off of the child. She had suffered enough already. All of Izuku's hastily thought up plans were for naught, however, as the captor, enraged with the girl's crying, moved to slap the girl. Unable to stop himself, almost unaware he had even moved, Izuku jolted forward, catching the man's hand before it was able to make contact. In a practiced gesture, Izuku twisted the man's hand behind his back with as much force as the boy could muster. Initially, the man yelped in pain, but it didn't take him long to recover. While Izuku had been training conscientiously, form lost out to sheer strength when the man brutally slammed Izuku into the brick wall of the alley. Stars dotted his vision as he let go of the man's arm solely from pain, and Izuku barely registered the meaty fingers that wrapped around his throat. "Listen here, kid," the man growled. "You're going to leave and forget that you ever saw us if you want to live. Got it?" Izuku's eyes focused on the little girl, who was sobbing now, pleading, "Please, I promise I'll be good. I just want to see Mama again." He was aware that his breathing was becoming more and more shallow as those fingers pressed harder and harder on his throat. Feeling faint, Izuku realized that he may have had technique on his side, but the man undeniably had size, experience, and strength on his side. "So, are you going to walk away?" the man demanded, his fingers seemingly prepared to crush Izuku's esophagus. Out of desperation, Izuku nodded frantically, his fingers clawing at the man's hands. When they did loosen, Izuku gasped, drawing in all the air he could take in. Falling limply to the ground, the small boy coughed, every movement causing more pain. "Consider yourself lucky," the man said, roughly grasping the girl by her forearm. "And don't bother looking for me. With my quirk I can easily crush your skinny neck, and I won't hesitate. Besides, by now disappearing is my specialty. No one can find me unless I want them to." Part of Izuku wanted to doubt the man, but he had been able to abduct a child without a single eyewitness. He was shaking, and he knew he couldn't take the man in a real fight. Izuku practiced diligently, but 9 months of training could only lend him so much help. If he fought and lost, it would only end up worse for the girl, and possibly with him dead. He only hoped the man wasn't very fast. Struggling to his feet, Izuku was grateful when the man didn't look back. Taking a deep breath, Izuku geared himself up before pushing himself to run at full speed, ducking down lower to the ground to catch the little girl by her torso, relatively easily ripping her from the man's grasp. The man shouted in indignant surprise, but Izuku was already sprinting with the girl cradled close to his chest, adrenaline pushing his exhausted legs faster than he'd ever run before. He felt like he couldn't breathe deeply enough and he was feeling a bit lightheaded, but still Izuku murmured comforting phrases to the child as he held her even closer, fully aware that the man was gaining on them every second. 3 more blocks. That was all Izuku had to make it, 3 more blocks and they would be safe. Ironically, this was the most deserted Izuku had ever seen this part of the city. He had quickly left the abandoned neighborhood behind. Now he was only half a block away from his destination, and there was no one to hear the man's enraged yells or Izuku's cries of help. It was then, when he had momentarily slowed down to turn a corner, that he felt a grasping hand barely brush the collar of his shirt. Yelping at the closeness of the man, Izuku threw himself forward, grateful that the enraged man was too intent on Izuku to realize where they were going. His arms ached from the weight of the child when Izuku crashed through the doors of the local police station. Once in their safe haven, Izuku immediately set the child on the ground for fear of dropping her. It was for the best, as milliseconds later he was tackled to the ground by her captor. Those same crushing hands wrapped around Izuku's neck, and the boy's last fuzzy thoughts were an apology to his mother. His vision swam in and out of focus as a veritable legion of police officers were surrounding him, taking the man away in handcuffs. Somewhere the girl was crying and the man was yelling and his throat hurt and all the officers were trying to talk to him. "Quiet," an authoritative voice rang out, reaching even Izuku. Then someone was helping him into a chair, and the little girl who he had carried was clinging to him, more tears trailing down her cheeks. Then someone else was talking to Izuku, and then the pain lessened. It was still there, but Izuku no longer felt like he was going to pass out, and his mind resumed a fraction of its normal function. A man in a trench coat was looking at Izuku, concerned. "I'm Detective Tsukauchi. I apologize about the chaos, but would you like to tell us what's going on?" Izuku blinked a few times, his vision still slightly fuzzy. I'm Midoriya Izuku. I was on a run when I heard a child in an abandoned part of town. I saw this girl with that man that was attacking me, and she seemed really scared. Then I recognized her as the girl on the news, the one who went missing a few days ago. Detective Tsukauchi looked up sharply from his notes, and Izuku idly observed that the man would likely have been described as plain-looking, just like Izuku himself. But then the man was talking, and Izuku had to remind himself to listen. You mean the girl that disappeared without a trace, Tanaka Kimiko? That's my name, a quivering voice piped up, and every eye turned to the child in Izuku's arms. I couldn't remember her name, Izuku said. But her captor noticed me and attacked, telling me to forget I saw anything. I knew I couldn't fight him, so I grabbed her and ran here. He smiled down at the child that was holding onto him with a death grip. I know I'm probably in trouble, and it was kind of a stupid move, but I regret nothing. The detective shut his notebook with a snap. On the contrary, Midoriya, I want to commend you. You were a hero today, and you should be proud. You exercised your best judgment, and because of that I get to call a distraught mother and tell her that Kimiko is okay. And it's all due to a teenage boy. When the man's words sank in, Izuku's eyes filled with tears. Really? Absolutely. I need to give your mother a call as well, but before I forget, did you use your quirk at all? I'd hate to have to write you up for illegal quirk use, Tsukauchi said with regret. No, Izuku said slowly. I'm quirkless. As the words left his mouth, Izuku found himself looking down. He couldn't stomach the thought of seeing the detective's look of pride turn to disappointment as he realized that Izuku was defective, a waste of space. That makes things easier, then. Chin up, kid, that just makes what you've done even more amazing. If you ever had the inclination, I think you would make an amazing detective. The last part was added just before Tsukauchi swept out of the room, unaware that he left behind a wide-eyed boy with a growing sense of hope and a new dream blossoming in his hazy mind. Chapter 4. Kimiko gradually calmed down, flashes of her personality shining out from under her fear and confusion. She listened to the officers and for the most part she did as they asked, but she absolutely refused to move very far from Izuku, who was still dazed, but happy nonetheless. She was a cute child underneath the dirt, with wide brown eyes that still held too many tears. From what the officers could ascertain, she wasn't very injured, only a handful of scrapes and bruises. Izuku felt an odd protectiveness towards her, but he supposed it made sense that the feeling was foreign. He'd never been able to protect people other than replacing them as a target before. So when a grubby hand anchored itself in Izuku's, he couldn't help but melt a little inside. Apparently Kimiko loved stories, and so at his prompting she started telling him a rambling tale that could vaguely be recognized as Cinderella. She was in the middle of telling Izuku the details on Cinderella's carriage when the door swung open. Where is she? Where's Kimiko? A frantic voice rang out. Eyes wide, Kimiko snapped to attention. Mama? A small smile settled on Izuku's lips as he carefully set the child on the ground. He observed as the two rushed towards each other, meeting in the middle of the station in a flurry of hugs and tears, each almost disbelieving that the other was there. All present police personnel watched, smiling witnesses to the reunion. Many of the officers nodded to Izuku, acknowledging what he had done. Despite the pounding in his head, Izuku couldn't help but grin widely, tears streaming down his face. Matching tears on her cheeks, Kimiko's mother clutched her daughter with desperation. Where was she? How did you find my baby? Detective Tsukauchi smiled. You have that boy over there to thank. His name is Midoriya Izuku, and he's the one that found and saved Kimiko. A gasp came from the doorway. Ma Izuku did what? It might have all been in his head, but Izuku would have sworn that all of his pain dulled slightly when his mother walked in. Inko immediately rushed to her son, worry etched on every line of her face. How are you feeling, Izuku? Do you need anything? The battered boy shoved himself to his feet, throwing his arms around his mother. Mom, I can still help people. I want to be a detective. Inko was clearly surprised, but she merely patted her son's back. You'll be an amazing detective. Kimiko's mother walked over to the Midoriyas, Kimiko still tight in her grasp. I'm so sorry you got hurt, but thank you for protecting my baby. I can never, the woman promptly burst into tears, losing any semblance of composure. The police near my house told me to prepare to have her brought back in a body bag. You saved me from planning my daughter's funeral alone. Unable to help herself, Inko gently embraced the other mother. It's okay now, your daughter is safe now. I don't know how you've been able to function. I can only imagine how I would feel if my Izuku had been taken. Kimiko took the opportunity to latch once more onto Izuku's leg, giggling when he ruffled her hair. He turned his attention to her mother once his own mom finally released the emotional woman. I'm Tanaka Amaya, Kimiko's mother said with a wobbly smile. I can never thank you enough for bringing my daughter back to me. I just need to know where and how you found her. He had the full attention of both mothers, as Inko clearly needed to know what had happened as well. Swallowing, Izuku once more tried to focus his hazy mind. Where to start? I was on a run, and I went farther than usual. I wandered into an abandoned neighborhood when I heard a little kid. I thought that didn't seem right, so I went to investigate. I saw Kimiko and a man that seemed really suspicious, and it was obvious that they had been kind of living in this alleyway. After a minute I recognized Kimiko as a missing child, so I knew I had to do something. The man saw me, and we fought. He won, and left me there, but I couldn't just leave her. I'm pretty sure it was all adrenaline, but I got up and grabbed her before he noticed I was there, and then I ran as fast as I could to the police station. I barely made it in the doors and set Kimiko down when he caught up to me. Inko gently touched the angry bruise marks on Izuku's throat, anger burning in her normally sedate green eyes. In a steely voice, she asked, Did the police catch the man? They pulled him off of me and cuffed him right then and there. Amaya bit her lip. I'm truly sorry that you got hurt, but I'm even more grateful that you saved my daughter. How can I ever repay you? Izuku immediately began shaking his head. You don't need to repay me, I just wanted her to be safe. It must have been so scary for Kimiko, I can't even imagine. As he dissolved into a fit of mumbling, Inko and Amaya traded contact information, each promising to keep in touch with the other. Kimiko, however, still hugging Izuku's leg, tugged on the material of his pants to catch his attention. Big brother? Nearly choking, Izuku weakly said, Yes? Will you visit me? I want to see you again. Looking into those wide brown eyes, Izuku found himself crouching down next to her and saying, Yes, of course I will. And with those words, it was inevitable. Both of these small families were inextricably tied together. It wasn't long after that Kimiko had to be questioned herself, now that she was calm enough to be questioned, and the Tanakas left after a last embrace filled with tears. Both Midoriyas were holding back tears of their own, but Izuku felt like he was going to pass out. Inko noticed and pulled the nearest police officer aside. My son needs to see a doctor. Can we leave yet? I believe Detective Tsukauchi already got his testimony, and we have his contact information. He should be good to go, the police officer said. In fact, I'll take you myself, if you would like. Oh, we would hate to be a bother, Inko said nervously. It's no trouble at all. In fact, you'll be doing me a favor. I get bragging rights for helping the local hero, the officer said with a bright smile. I'm Officer Saito, by the way. It's a privilege to meet you, Midoriya. Izuku started to follow his mother and the officer to the car, but something was bothering his hazy mind. Hospital, medicine, then he gasped. Mom, today's the last day to sign up for those EMT classes. They're only open till 5. You want to take EMT classes, kid? Officer Saito asked curiously. Izuku nodded vehemently. I want to be able to help as many people as I can. Well, you're in luck. They had to relocate those classes to our spare room here at the station because the normal building is getting renovated. If you leave the paperwork with us, we'll make sure it gets where it needs to be, Saito said with another bright smile. She disappeared into the precinct and reappeared with the necessary form and a pen. It barely took a minute for Izuku and Inko to fill everything out, and then Saito rushed into what Izuku suspected was Detective Tsukauchi's office. Days later, Izuku would be thrilled to receive an email accepting him into the course. What he would never know, however, was that he had been accepted under duress. The instructor had hesitated allowing in a 15-year-old, but a smiling detective had kindly informed her that if Izuku was denied, they would have to find somewhere else to hold the class. Izuku had been smiling, excited at the prospect of EMT training when his eyes rolled in the back of his head and his knees buckled. He was only saved from hitting the ground hard when Officer Saito stepped in at the last moment, catching his limp body thanks to her stellar reflexes. Saito cursed. He must have some internal bleeding. Let's go. Inko helped load her son into the police car, with barely enough time for her to climb in herself before it sped off. The sound of sirens filled the air as Saito tore across the city in record time. Izuku drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of being carried. Then he was on a bed with a familiar doctor talking to his mom and Officer Saito. Pieces of the conversation made it through the haze of his mind, but he didn't have the mental clarity to piece it into a clear scenario. That would come later. Know if this is from bullying again? He's been in the hospital for bullying? Do you have names? Fractured ribs and nasty concussion, he passed out because. Stay awake? Exhaustion, I think. Make sure. Then even the voices faded to nothingness, and for once Izuku didn't even dream. Sleep was a comforting absence of everything until he woke naturally, immediately greeted by each and every one of his aches and pains. He had no way of knowing how much time had passed, or even what year it currently was. When he groaned, there was a series of frantic footsteps before his bedroom door burst open. Izuku, baby, how are you feeling? Like I got hit by a bus, he said, cracking a small smile. But pretty good, all things considered. Grunting, the boy sat up, swinging his legs out of the bed. Luckily, there was a nurse with a minor healing quirk working yesterday. She was able to shorten your recovery time to a few days instead of a few weeks. Oh, and Valiant still wants you to come to the dojo today. He said you could work on meditation, Inko said. Do you want me to stay home with you? I can call into work. No, I'll be fine, Mom, Izuku promised. I do feel a lot better. He refused to make her guilty over his guilt at the prospect of making her miss work. If you're sure, Izuku. Oh, the doctor's orders are that you're not allowed to do anything more physically demanding than walk a few blocks at a time. I will find out if you push yourself, and I will let Valiant decide what to do with you, Inko warned before kissing his forehead. I love you and I'm proud of you. Taking his mother's words to heart, Izuku didn't do anything to push himself. After feeling how his body protested every movement, he knew it wasn't wise to tempt fate. Instead, he pushed his brain to the limit. Izuku calculated that if he really worked hard, he could finish high school in a little under a year. If he started now, he could have a couple degrees in a little over 2. Maybe less, if the degrees he had in mind had enough shared classes. In the meantime, he would continue his work at Valiant's dojo and EMT training. He itched to go back and research a multitude of police cases that he had briefly heard of when he was younger, but ultimately ignored because they didn't involve heroes. Now Izuku wanted to know everything, all in the pursuit of becoming the best detective he could. Plan in place, Izuku lost himself in his schoolwork, only remembering to eat and leave for martial arts because of the alarms he had set on his phone. When it was time, Izuku walked leisurely to Valiant's dojo, enjoying the summer day around him. Stepping into the dojo, however, Izuku hadn't expected the chorus of shouts that surrounded him. Little Midoriya. It's our hero. Hey kid, can I have your autograph? Izuku felt his face blush bright red as he was surrounded by his friends. Hey, everyone. Give Midoriya space, a gruff voice said. The crowd of boys parted to show Valiant smiling down at this student. Welcome back, my boy. As the others warm up, I would like to speak with you. Almost magically, the other boys fell into their spots, running through the actions that were second nature to them by now. Izuku followed Valiant to his office, sitting down at the man's insistence. The former pro hero smiled at him fondly. Young Midoriya, do you know why I accepted you as my student? I can see that you don't. When I first met you, I could sense a deep despair, as well as a deep hope. I don't know the full reason for your despair, but I don't need to. You've begun finding yourself, finding your purpose as well as your worth. Thank you, Sensei, Izuku said, trying with all of his might not to cry. Your desire to help others is a noble one, Midoriya. But be careful to help yourself as well. Keep improving so you don't have to be hurt in the process of sparing others. Sometimes wounds are inevitable, but I won't have you destroy yourself. Yes, Sensei. Today you meditate, Valiant said seriously. I sense you still hold onto an incomplete image of yourself. Come to terms with who Midoriya Izuku is. You are quirkless, yes, but you are so much more. Now Izuku nodded, tears finally escaping. Yes, Sensei. Chapter 5. Midoriya, wait. Izuku stopped, turning to find a friendly face pursuing him. Oh, Ojiro. I forgot to ask you how the entrance exam went. The quiet blonde moved in next to Izuku with a smile. It went better than I expected. Now I just have to wait for my results. I'm sure you got in, you're amazing. Izuku exclaimed. I don't know, there were some amazing quirks. I thought I was doing okay, but there was this kid with an explosion quirk that took out so many robots that the rest of us almost couldn't find any to fight. Ojiro smiled a little sadly. I knew I wasn't going to be the best, I just hope I did well enough to get in. What's done is done, young Ojiro. I'm sure you conducted yourself with honor, Valiant said, appearing in the doorway of the dojo. You as well, young Midoriya. Both of you go home, rest. You've earned it. As the two boys walked home, a few blocks away one detective Tsukauchi sat in his office, rubbing his eyes from the mound of paperwork that sat in front of him. With a sigh, he set down the paperwork and started clicking through the news, looking for the latest events all might have been involved in. The announcement that the #1 hero was going to be a teacher at UA had overshadowed all other news, including the recent kidnapping and recovery of Tanaka Kimiko. Toshinori's face filled the screen again and again, similar stories of the blonde's bravery and heroism filtering through. It was paranoia that led Naomasa to periodically check the news to see that his good friend's secret was secure. He wanted to protect Toshinori, yes, but it was also a matter of national security. He didn't know what made him do it, but something possessed Naomasa to click on a video from months ago. It was a video of Toshinori saving a boy from a sludge villain. Tsukauchi had been particularly busy with a case at that time, so he hadn't watched the video very closely. The video opened with the image of a blonde kid struggling in the grasp of the sludge villain while a number of pro-heroes hung back, looking helpless. Somewhere behind the camera there was a scuffle and then a flash of green darted towards the villain, a scrawny boy flinging an oversized backpack directly into the villain's face. Naomasa paused the video with shaking hands, staring at the screen. Slowly standing, he slipped out of his office. Saito, Nakamura, I need an opinion on something. Whatcha got, boss? Saito asked, immediately snapping to attention. Just come watch this. The two officers shuffled in, crowding around the computer where the detective had started the video over. I remember this, Nakamura said. All Might saves the kid, but wasn't there another? No. You're kidding, Saito whispered. It can't be. Thank goodness, I'm not crazy. You see Midoriya too? Tsukauchi asked. We need to train that kid and give him a badge, Nakamura said. He's going to be amazing. Why don't we? Saito said playfully. They let baby heroes have provisional licenses, why not us too? She had asked the question in jest, but Tsukauchi froze in place, his mind racing. A provisional officer, I have some paperwork to do, he said, shooing the other two away. Picking up the phone. Once the other person answered, he said, it's Detective Tsukauchi. Who would I have to talk to about potentially begin a new program? Days later found the Midoriya family in Izuku's room at an hour yet untouched by the sun. However, both Midoriyas were wide awake, and Inko stared intently at the screen of her son's laptop. And you swear you didn't pull any all-nighters? Just the one, Izuku swore, his smile blinding. And you haven't missed your martial arts of your EMT classes? Not a single one. He chirped. Oh, by the way, tomorrow Gunhead is teaching the class, and Valiant told me that he wanted me to have a session with just Gunhead and Ojiro, so I'll probably be home late. His mother's green eyes were still fixed on the computer screen where two emails were displayed side by side. One was a notification of Izuku's completion of his first year in high school, barely a week into what would have been his first semester. The second was an acceptance letter to Japan's most prestigious college, as well as a full scholarship. They had been particularly impressed by Izuku's quirk analysis, and when they had learned his age, the head of the quirk studies department had demanded that the school accept Izuku and made sure he attended, whatever the cost. They would let Izuku have as many majors as he wanted, provided that one of them was quirk studies. He could complete almost all of his work online, he just had to visit the actual campus every few weeks. The university would even pay for his commute to Hosu. With this, another piece fell into Izuku's plan. He was finished with EMT training, today was just a ceremony of sorts to celebrate their completion. He had to admit he was a little sad it would be over. He had started off on the wrong foot with his instructor for some reason, but after enough time the two came to a mutual respect. However, the worst part of his class being over was that he no longer had a reason to stop by the police station. Maybe he could bring taiyaki for the entire station as a thank you for so man things. He could then casually bring up the idea of observing the job of a police officer. After all, he couldn't make a habit of showing up at crime scenes like he had with villain fights. At this point all of the police officers knew him, and they would reprimand him for not taking his safety into account. For the first time in years, Izuku was genuinely excited about his future. So can I do it, Mom? Can I start going to college? Finally pulling her eyes away from the emails, she smiled. It would be a waste to refuse. Just don't push yourself too hard. Send me that professor's email. I'll set up a meeting with him so we can get paperwork done and talk over all the details. Izuku beamed, thrilled beyond words. Today is your EMT training certification, isn't it? My little boy, a certified EMT at 15 years old. Izuku, I'm so proud, Inko said, tears filling her eyes. I wish I could make it to the ceremony. I could take off work if you wanted. No, it's fine. I have people to support me now, and I already know that you support me. Today is a really important day at work for you, so good luck. It's my turn to support you, Izuku said, hugging his mother tightly. Have a good day at work. Kissing his forehead, Inko left, letting his door quietly close behind her. He waited a few moments before Izuku closed both emails, opening a folder on his laptop, a nagging feeling plaguing him. It was early, really early. He had already been on a run, and the sun had yet to rise. Dialing a number that was becoming more and more familiar, anxiety fluttered in his stomach. The police officers had been nothing but kind to him, but he didn't know if he could handle having his new dream crushed just like his old one. Musutafu Police Station, Officer Sasaki speaking. What can I do for you today? Swallowing thickly, Izuku stammered, Hi, this is Midoriya Izuku. Little Midoriya. How are you? Fine, I was looking at some old news articles and I noticed a pattern. There are 3 villains that have escaped being caught until now, and based on their old patterns, I think they're going to strike today. That said, Izuku held his breath, terrified of how Saito was going to react. He held a deep respect for the officer, and he knew he couldn't take it if she laughed him off. Explain further, little Midoriya. Wait. Let me get the detective on the line. Fainter, as if Sasaki was holding the phone away from her mouth, he heard, Naomasa. Your son is on the line with important information. What are you talking about? I don't have. Midoriya is waiting. Almost immediately the other line picked up. Detective Tsukauchi speaking. And so Izuku blurted out all of his suspicions and evidence, including who the villains were, where they were most likely to be, and the best way to detain them. Which heroes would you recommend us calling in? The detective asked. Izuku thought for a moment. Kamui Woods for the first, then Mount Lady for the second, and for the last, Midnight. They're villains that work together, so even though their attacks would be separate, they would be coordinated with one another. It's best to have heroes that can capture them quickly. Thanks for calling in, Midoriya. You've been a huge help, the detective said, before hanging up. While Izuku buried himself in schoolwork, Detective Tsukauchi had been busy single-handedly setting up a course and test for provisional police badges. Hearing the boy's deductions validated Tsukauchi's efforts. Looking at the evidence Midoriya had laid out, Tsukauchi could kick himself for how obvious it all was. Except it wasn't. Even with years of experience and a degree in criminology, Tsukauchi didn't think he could have put all of this together. Contact the heroes he mentioned, Sasaki, Tsukauchi ordered. I'll contact the police stations in charge of those areas. When you're done, call in Kondo and set up a surveillance of the third area Midoriya suggested. You're really trusting of the imaginings of a 14-year-old boy? Officer Mori asked with a sneer. Mori had slowly been alienating himself from the rest of the police station with his open dislike of Midoriya. He's 15, Sasaki hissed, jabbing his ribs with an elbow. Besides, you have to see this kid. He's different than anything you've ever seen. You've always been a bleeding heart, Sasaki, he said, slightly glaring at the petite woman. No, she's right. Whatever he ends up doing, Midoriya is going to change the world, and I want to watch it happen, Tsukauchi said, an unusual gleam in his eye. Now go, our time is limited. The 2 officers saluted before leaving, and as Tsukauchi made the phone calls he needed to, he couldn't help but smile to himself. No one would realize the full ramifications of that day. Detective Tsukauchi had no way of knowing that with those 3 villains in police custody, his good friend Yagi Toshinori would not expend all of his energy before arriving to the school. In fact, he had enough time to teach Class 1A, and still time to spare. There was no way to know of the untold fear and injuries that Class 1A was spared from, all because the number 1 hero was at the USJ from the very beginning. The main villains escaped, yes, but the whole incident was minuscule compared to what it could have been. Although slightly shaken, the class walked away almost virtually unscathed, and Izuku's new dreams seemed all the more closer. Despite everything that could not be known, there were 2 irrefutable things. The first was that on that day, Midoriya Izuku began to truly accept himself for who and what he was. The second was that this day was the first time Midoriya Izuku met Uraraka Ochako.